We've talked then about how there are physiological factors that lead to addiction, and we've said that really when we come down to looking at addiction or dependency, we need to look at it as a convergence of psychosocial factors and physiological ones, and that's a theme we'll repeat a number of times in this module. So we asked you to take a look at what psychosocial factors you thought were most dominant, and let's see how well you did. These aren't necessarily in any particular order, but I think it's a logical place for us to start by looking at the person's social role models. In particular, we want to look at their family and at their circle of same age or similar aged peers. Now, when it comes to family, the research is pretty clear that when a family has engaged in the use of substances, both legal and illicit, in front of their children, it's far more likely their children will go up to use those substances as well. And this is true about coffee and cigarettes as much as it is about alcohol, marijuana, and so forth. And it's interesting because sometimes children have been raised in families where there's a considerable amount of trauma associated with the use of those drugs, including alcohol or hard drugs. But even though you might think that that would lead the child to not use it, and there are some indeed where that's the case, they're socialized in such a way that they're very averse to drugs. In some cases, people, even though they recognize that the drug is an aversive thing, are still led to it because the modeling of a parent is so strong, and also because in many cases the individual has not had an alternative model, doesn't have a better way of coping or socializing than what they've seen from their parents. And it's an important thing for us to discuss at this point the idea of peer clusters as well. There's been a considerable amount of research over the years regarding this. It seems as though many young people first become addicted to a group of people, and I use that word in this case very loosely, before they become dependent on a substance. The social choices that they make, and this is no great mystery to many parents, can make a huge difference in terms of whether or not they are exposed to the use of substances in a way that their social group is approving of. If they happen to be in a group where drugs are clearly not indicated as a possible way to socialize or recreate, then they tend not to become exposed to the substances. And as they get older, more mature, more aware of the possible impacts of substances, they're more likely to be bolstered against those temptations. When they're 13, 14, 15 years old, they're very developmentally vulnerable, and they're extremely connected to the idea of being socially included, and they're very averse to the idea of being socially rejected. And so the peers that they choose to hang around with can have this effect of making a drug seem more tolerable or more socially desirable. And because an individual may have difficulty making a transition from one group of friends to another, it's essentially true to say that in many cases people become socially dependent before they become chemically dependent. And this is why in some cases you hear of families who need to literally change schools or even more, change communities in order to help their child avoid becoming continuously dependent on a substance. Now, I want to make a sort of a personal note here as well, and this is something that comes from my experience, in this case, not as an educator in the field of mental health, but as an educator in a school system, period, and also as a person involved in minor sports. I see many people who assume that their child is not likely to be subject to this negative peer influence because they have brought their child into a milieu where they think there is very little likelihood to be exposed to drugs. For example, they take their child to a private school or they take their child to a sports team. But I have to caution parents and anybody who's out there trying to support individuals that are in the population of youth around the area of drugs, that there are going to be enclaves of drug users in every school and in every sports team, and it's more important than just bringing the child into that group that the parent monitor those friendships and play a mediating or refereeing or guiding role in those relationships. It's not enough to just hand the child over. I think that it's important to monitor what's going on in those relationships and to take an active interest. And one more thing about peers. A lot has been said over the years about the idea of whether or not drugs can be described as gateway drugs. And the science seems to be pretty clear that there is no physiological proof that there is such a thing as a gateway drug. In other words, the theory that a person would use a mild drug, say marijuana, and after a while crave a harder drug because of that and become tolerant and need to have something that's a harder drug, is not substantiated by research. But the idea of a drug as a gateway socially, there is some evidence to support this theory. In fact, it's considerable. And the reasoning is quite simple to understand. If an individual is in a social group that is utilizing a milder drug, say marijuana once again, that social group is quite likely to eventually include people who have experimented with harder drugs like crystal methamphetamine, crack cocaine, and so forth. And if they're in a social group where there's really no entry into drug activity at all, even with mild drugs, then it's very unlikely, of course, that the child's going to have exposure to more serious drugs of any kind. It's not a terribly complex notion. In fact, for most people, it will fall to reason to see that this is one way that we could describe the use of marijuana as a gateway activity. The same people that would be in a circle of people using marijuana or alcohol underage may also come to include people who have exposure to serious drugs or a more habituated use of drugs or some use of drugs that is problematic, for example, drinking and driving. And so, and the same is true of people who are consuming marijuana and purchasing it on the black market. There is a very good chance that the very same people who are selling them the marijuana are also selling other products, other drugs. And it is, after all, a commercial activity. And just in the same way as when we walk in to purchase something on a car lot or in any store, the salespeople will try to get us to move up in our purchase, to upsell us. These same practices occur amongst drug dealers and so forth as well. And so, for example, there are people, I've dealt with addicts who tell me quite commonly that it was very common for them to be given a free sample of a drug that was highly addictive, or to use a drug and find out that it had been laced with another drug. And this is a very common practice. So the gateway concept has less to do with the chemical properties of a drug and more to do with the social properties of people who would be involved in drug use being exposed to other drugs. Now, before we move off of social role models, we want to talk about the influence of the media on young people. And it's absolutely obvious to some of us that there is a glamorization of substances in the media in some instances. The question is whether or not that has a significant impact on a youth. And it's clear that it does not have the same level of impact on a youth as their closer peers. In other words, we know that if a person is coming from a family environment or a peer environment where drug use is not something that is tolerated or promoted, then they seem to be very much bolstered or somewhat immune to all the media influence around that substance. Conversely, when an individual is in that circle of people who seem to think that drug use is acceptable or even good, then they're obviously more likely to have that attitude towards drugs augmented or strengthened by media exposure. In a nutshell, the glamorization of drugs in the media is not likely on its own to convert a youth from a non-user to a user. But if a person is already vulnerable, then it can be a negative influence. We've talked in previous modules about the way untreated mental illness can sometimes lead to people using drugs as a self-medication. In other words, without even necessarily knowing exactly why or how what they're doing is affecting their mental health symptoms, there are many people who use the drug because it simply makes them feel better. And many of these people never ever know that they're experiencing mental health symptoms. Or in some cases, they do know, but they are reluctant to take the prescribed treatment because often of the stigma, in some cases because they don't like the side effects, and in other cases it's a financial or economic issue. And in many cases people carry with them some preconceptions. For example, I hear commonly from youth that they say, I would rather smoke marijuana than take my doctor's prescription for ADHD or depression or schizophrenia because it's natural. Marijuana is natural. And my standard response to this is arsenic is also natural, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's healthy. But of course, for many of these youth, they've already kind of lived with this value system for a long enough period of time that they've actually become habituated to or dependent on something like marijuana use or more advanced drugs. So stigma, as we talked about in Module 2, can have a very concrete downstream effect on people because it may keep them from being diagnosed or from following the treatment protocols prescribed by their doctor and their mental health support people. And as a result, many folks are utilizing illicit substances in order to treat a mental health issue. And in many cases, the effect of that is that both the mental health issue and the addiction become aggravated in a very nasty negative feedback loop. And it becomes very difficult, especially as this problem can go on for many years, for clinicians who often lack history of that person to know which problem came first. Is it the drugs causing the mental illness or the mental illness causing the use of the self-medication? So this is a very consistent issue that we would see in supporting individuals with drug and alcohol problems, and the numbers are differ from one study to the other, but it's not uncommon, for example, to hear the idea that 20% of people who are addicted to drugs are actually folks who have untreated or undiagnosed mental health issues. Age and gender play a very significant role in one's susceptibility to the psychological or psychosocial influences around drugs. Clearly, we know that younger people are more vulnerable to becoming addicted. They're not the only ones. It is possible to become exposed and addicted to drugs at any time in your life. And this is particularly true of people who have utilized prescription drugs that are habit forming and may not be aware fully of the possibility of addiction. And this happens, for example, with painkillers as well as with sedatives like benzodiazepines. But we normally think of addiction as being something that is started in a person's late adolescence or in their early 20s, and that's not an inaccurate perception. That is the most likely time. And the reason for that, of course, is that this person is in a developmental period where they lack a lot of worldliness and a strong understanding of how their behavior will have long-term consequences, and B, they're in a time in which they're trying very strongly, according to Erickson and many others, to define their identity and to establish power and to work to become independent of parental and other authority figures. And so these two things converging can be very difficult to deal with. And one of the phenomena that we need to talk about here is something called the personal fable. And the idea here is that many young people continue to believe that they are invincible in their late teens and early 20s until they either personally experience or brush close to tragedy. For example, a friend dies in a car accident as a result of drinking and driving, or somebody in their family has a serious issue as a result of this. These are often the ways that young people learn that what they're doing truly is risky. Up until that point, young people often truly perceive themselves as being the exception to a rule. They may cognitively and rationally understand that driving at excessive speeds or using substances and driving at excessive speeds are reckless behavior. But the idea of internalizing that and applying it to themselves is somewhat foreign because they still continue to believe in the idea that the fable of this reckless behavior doesn't apply to them personally, and that's how this gets its name. And it's not until they start to see that the morals of these particular fables are personal, are relevant to them, that they learn this. Unfortunately, many young people don't learn it until it's too late. And as far as gender goes, males tend to be more likely to respond to these psychosocial factors than females. Now, females are still exposed to them and still can actually, of course, become addicted to any of the substances that are out there, but it tends to be more likely that we'll see males. And this is reflected in the programming that we see in the community. For example, homeless shelters usually have anywhere from 4 to 10 times as many beds for men as for women. And the same is true true often in terms of treatment facilities. In some of the numbers around alcoholism, the incidence of alcoholism is 10 times as frequent in men as in women. And there are any number of reasons why this is possible. For example, we can describe the idea that young men are supposed to socialize by demonstrating bravado and masculinity, and the idea of taking risks and engaging in behavior that may be dangerous is tied to that. We might also talk about the idea that women are sometimes allowed more frequently in our society to seek help, moral and emotional support than men, and men may be more likely as a result to use drugs and alcohol as an escape, which is an alternative to not being able to speak about their issues. Now, the women that we do see come into care are often women who have been victims of another psychosocial factor, which basically includes abuse, particularly of a sexual nature, or spousal abuse for those who become addicted to substances later on. And in many cases, the women that we'll encounter who are addicted to a drug or alcohol have become addicted as a result of relationship choices they've made. They became had to make a choice in some cases to stay with a man and use a substance, or to leave a man and stay clean or sober, or to use a substance as a way of coping, as we said, with abuse. So gender has a role, but it's not, at this point, doesn't seem to be really connected to some sort of genetic underpinning as much as it does to our psychosexual expectations of males versus females. Many would argue that perhaps the biggest and most common psychosocial factor is loneliness. At its root, many people who are using alcohol are using it as a way of coping with the idea that they feel socially alienated or rejected, or they use it as a social lubricant to help themselves be able to cope. And this is why some people not only drink in what we might think of as recreational social occasions, but also in things like work occasions, because in some cases people need their liquid courage, as they say, or they use other substances to help bring up their energy level or make them more competitive. And as a result, the person can become addicted. So at the root of these sorts of things is the idea that people often feel lonely, they often feel desperate, they often will do just about anything to fit into a social circle. And in some cases, that comes down to the use of substances. We also want to look at the social value people place on drugs and the outlook that they may have, for example, on the drug as a symbol of rebelliousness or as a symbol or a way of becoming more extroverted. If a person doesn't believe that they personally have much social value, then a drug may be a way for them to improve their social value. Conversely, we can also talk, as I said, about the social value of the drug itself in that person's mind. For example, there are artists and performers who would have young people believe that standing up for the legalization of drugs is a major political and moral issue, and you personally may believe that yourself. And I'm not going to dispute whether that's true or not true, just that for some people, the idea of using a substance is more than something that is about a physiological response. It is about a psychological or philosophical, I should say, outlook. It's a matter of principle. And in fact, in some faiths, the use of marijuana is deeply embedded. And of course, Rastafarianism is one of them, although here in Canada we don't hear a great deal about that particular faith. But there are people for whom the use of a substance is part of their day-to-day outlook on the world, their political, philosophical, and religious outlooks, and we need to remember that. For many people, a way of the use of a drug is a way of repressing hostility or anger feelings, bitterness, and that can be secondary to trauma experienced in our life. Sexual abuse, for example, was mentioned earlier, or it could be trauma, for example, a person coming back from times of war and dealing with symptoms such as post-traumatic stress disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder has obviously fits up here under our undiagnosed or untreated mental illness category, but it's also quite common for people to say, if I don't utilize marijuana or alcohol, I'm basically uncivilized. I'm basically not somebody that others can live with, and I need it to help make myself take the edge off and feel as though I can manage in day-to-day life. So those are the most common psychosocial factors. They're not the only ones, but they're the ones that are perhaps most common, and many of them happen in combination for the people we'll support.